Welcome my dear students. Myself Mrs.M.ArunjunaiSelvi, Assistant Professor, Department of Computer Science from SFR College for Women, Sivagasi. Today we are going to discuss about deadlock avoidance. In an operating system, deadlock is an important concept. So now moving on to our objectives. In this class we are going to discuss about introduction to deadlock, what are the methods to avoid deadlock, that is deadlock avoidance, and in that we are going to discuss about resource allocation graph and Banker's algorithm. So now what is deadlock? In OS there are many processes that are requesting for resources. So in that case there are situations, there are resources which was kept idle sometime, and also situations, there are processes that are waiting for the resources unwanted amount of times. So in these kind of situations, which leads to a situation called deadlock. That is, the definition for a deadlock is a set of blocked process, each holding a resource and waiting to acquire a resource held by another process in the same set. Look at an example. Suppose a system has two printers. There are two processes, that are P1 and P2. Each holds one resource already, otherwise each printer is held by each process already. But now when a process P1 is requesting for the resource R2, which is already held by P2, what will happen at this stage? The P1 will wait for unwanted amount of time. This leads to a situation called deadlock. There are four possible situations which leads to deadlock. So look at the picture in this slide. It is the best example for a deadlock situation. Here the process P1 and P2 is waiting for the resources R1 and R2 unwantedly. So this leads to a deadlock situation. There are four situations. They are mutual exclusion, hold and wait, no preemption, circular wait. Mutual exclusion means every process is under a mutual bond, which means a process, only one process will be executed at a time that can use the resources. Hold and wait situation means a process will hold the resource and waits for another resource to complete its execution. This leads to a deadlock condition. The next one is a no preemption, which means a process will hold the resource and it won't release the resource until it completes its whole execution. So other processes waiting for that particular resource will need to wait unwantedly. This leads to a critical problem called deadlock. The next one is a circular wait. It is a most commonly error, otherwise most common occurring deadlock in the case of operating system. So circular wait is nothing but the processes will wait for unwanted amount of time circularly. Look at the example here. In this case, the process P0 is waiting for a resource which is already held by P1. Likewise, P1 is waiting for a resource which is already held by P2. In this way, the nth process Pn is waiting for the resource which is already held by P0. At this case, none of the process will get complete its execution, which leads to a circular wait situation. Even though there are n number of resources and n number of processes available, none of the process will complete its execution. This is the situation of most common situation in a OS. This is resolved using the deadlock avoidance method. So now moving into deadlock avoidance. Deadlock avoidance is the simplest and the most useful method to avoid deadlock. In this, we have to allocate the maximum number of resources needed for that particular process in an earlier stage. So this avoids the complication in allocation, resource allocation. So the next is the deadlock algorithms available. There are many deadlock algorithms available, which we will discuss in the upcoming slides. So deadlock algorithm dynamically examines the resources and allots resources based on it. This reduces the circular wait issues. The next is the resource allocation state. It is nothing but the number of available and the allocated resources and the maximum demands of the process. Now when a process requests a available resource and a resource is available and it is easy to access, so in this case the system will decide if immediate allocation leads the system in a safe state. At this case we need to discuss about what is a safe state and an unsafe state. A safe state is a situation where a system is in good condition, and otherwise if a system is in safe state, then which means there is no deadlock. If a system is in unsafe state, which means there is a possibility of a deadlock. Now, what is the purpose of deadlock avoidance? Is that it ensures the system will never enter into a unsafe state. The objective of deadlock avoidance is to keep the system always in an unsafe state. So, to achieve this, we are having few algorithms. The most commonly used two algorithms are, otherwise two methods are resource allocation graph and Banker's algorithm. Resource allocation graph means single instance of a resource type. Banker's algorithm suits well for multiple instances of a single resource type. What does it mean was resource allocation graph, which means consider I have a PC and I have a printer, one processor, one resource. It is called as a single instance of a resource type. Example, second one, multiple instance. I have a system, I have a PC and it is connected with n number of resources like a scanner, a printer, a tape drive, otherwise any other output devices, which means a processor connected to a single resource is called as single instance of a resource type. A processor connected to multiple instance means multiple devices on a single device. So, now moving on to the resource allocation graph. So, while considering resource allocation graph, we need to discuss about some edges. First, the claim edge. Claim edge is nothing but a processor may request for a resource in future. So, process P1 may request for a resource P1 R1 in future. It will be represented using a dotted line, otherwise dashed line, which was given in the first statement, PA dotted arrow RJ, which is like a claim edge. So, any number of process can claim for any number of resources at the initial stages. The next is the request edge. Okay. After the claim edge, when a resource is allocated, otherwise when a process is requesting for a resource, the dotted arrow becomes a complete solid arrow. It is represented in the using a solid arrow, PA solid arrow RJ. The next is the assignment edge. Once when a process requested for a resource and once the resource is free, it is assigned to the process. It is represented using the inverted solid arrow, which is represented in the third point, PA solid arrow RJ, which is called as the assignment edge. Then the last one is the, once when we assigned an edge, which means after completing the resources, after completing the execution, the process will preempt the resource. So, the next processes which is waiting with the claim edge will be allocated. Otherwise, the next resources which is waiting for the processes will be allocated. So, look at the example. The picture 1 shows the safe state, picture 2 shows the unsafe state. So, which means in the picture 1, the P2 sends a request edge to R1 and already the resource R2 is used by P1. So, the P2 will wait until P1 completes its execution. After completion, the resource R1 is allotted for the process P2. In the same picture, look at the dotted lines between P1 to R2 and P2 to R2, which means these two are claim edges. That means the P1, P2 are requesting, otherwise claiming for the resources R2 for future use. So, now look at the picture 2, which is an example unsafe state. There is a claim edge between P1 and R2, which means the P1 may request the resource in future. Okay. The next is the R2 to P1, which means the resource R2 is allocated to P2 and P2 is requesting for R1. R1 is already allocated to P1. Here look at this picture P2, which leads to a circular wait. Look at the arrows, it leads to a circular wait, but look at the picture P1, there is no circular wait. So, henceforth based on the allocation we can fix whether the system is in a safe state or in a unsafe state. Hence, resource allocation graph is very important in identifying deadlock. So, in this way we can reduce circular wait with the help of resource allocation graph. As I said earlier, resource allocation graph well suits for resource of single instance. Okay. Now, moving on to multiple instance of a resource type, that is a processor which is connected to n number of resources like printer, scanner and any other output devices. These kind of problems can be solved using the Banker's algorithm. So, Banker's algorithm is named after the banking problem, henceforth it is called as a Banker's algorithm. So, in the Banker's algorithm, this algorithm suits for processors with multiple instances. Each processor have to mention the maximum resources that is needed for that particular process. When a process requests a resource, it may have to wait. When a process gets all its resources, it must return them in a finite amount of time after completing its execution. So, Banker's algorithm has many simple algorithms within it. So, on executing the Banker's algorithm, we can resolve the problem of deadlock avoidance. So, these are the two commonly used methods to avoid deadlock. So, by having these algorithms, we can reduce the circular wait and we can have a healthy process resource relationship among the OS, in the OS. Thank you. Thank you students. Thank you for listening.